Well, I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving. I wasn't here last weekend, as if you were here, you knew that. And thanks to Reverend Maggie for speaking last week. I did have the opportunity last week to speak on Sunday at the North Jersey Center for Spiritual Living, which is in Montclair. And that was where our check went for those that donated to the Hurricane Sandy Relief Fund. That center has been managing that trust fund, and they had received, by the time I got there, about $26,000 from various centers around. And there's quite a bit of need there, as you can imagine. It continues to go on. They actually had a group leaving the center after service to go down to Atlantic City and work with another New Thought group. There's a New Thought group, and their name eludes me, it's Soul something, but they travel and send in teams whenever there are natural disasters. And they were down in Joplin, Missouri a few years ago for the tornadoes, and they sent about a dozen people to Atlantic City past weekend to do some cleanup and rebuilding and things like that. So there's a lot of that happening up in the Northeast right now. And out of that has come a conversation within Centers for Spiritual Living about creating a centralized disaster relief process where we will provide funding and support in a little more quick and centralized way. So you'll hear more about that as we go forward. I also had the opportunity to speak in Baltimore on Tuesday night at the center I founded back in the 90s, and they asked me to come in and speak on evolution. Which I agreed to do, and the conversations about evolution today are not what most people think they are. It's not about, is evolution real, or is it evolution versus creation? That conversation in terms of people that are on the leading edge of evolutionary conversation today is old stuff, considered settled. I was talking to one fellow who says, I don't even have that conversation anymore. If someone tells me they don't believe in evolution, I say, that's like not believing in gravity. You know, it's just so settled. Even though I know that less than 50% of Americans believe in evolution. But that's another story. So when we talk about evolution today, the evolution of consciousness, we're talking about something that is a much more accelerated conversation, if you will. And when we talk about evolution, today, we're talking about a process that recognizes that change in terms of human consciousness, capacities, and understanding is accelerating and accelerating and accelerating. Now, back in the day, say 1 million years ago, most of you don't remember that, but 1 million years ago, when the first humans were appearing, evolution was occurring. Evolution, I'm talking about evolution in terms of how we understand and relate to the universe around us. It was occurring, but it was occurring so glacially slow that you could go literally hundreds of thousands of generations without any significant change in the way people related to the world around them. Now, the pace began to pick up about 5,000 years ago when what we consider to be the beginning of recorded history, when people began to write things down. And ever since then, it's been changing more and more rapidly. The rate of change is increasing exponentially. The rate of change is increasing exponentially. The total of all human knowledge is now doubling every month. So you think your library's up to speed, you know, maybe not. So we're going to look at what does that mean, and there we go. Our old buddy Deepak says, so the universe is constantly moving in the direction of higher evolutionary impulses, creativity, abstraction, and meaning. The universe. So when you talk about the concept of evolutionaries today, and I'm currently reading a wonderful book called Evolutionaries by Carter Phipps, who talks about, and we'll see a quote from him in a little bit, but what they're talking about is not just individual species changing, but the entire universe being sort of a container for the evolutionary process. And when futurists, who are people that kind of look at what the future might look like unfolding based on what we know today, are looking forward, many of them are looking forward to the idea of consciousness of living beings beginning to transfer out through the universe from places like Earth where there may be life, and eventually becoming conscious intelligence being present throughout the entire universe. We know that what evolution is a process toward greater complexity. It's a self-organizing process toward greater complexity. If you look at the universe itself, at the time of the Big Bang, there was hydrogen. So what you need to create this universe is hydrogen plus time. And out of that comes all of this, all of the other elements that didn't exist in the beginning. So what evolution shows us of our own physical universe is that it's a continual process of generating something out of nothing. A continual process of generating something out of nothing. This is a model of evolution that was developed by Barbara Marx Hubbard, who's a futurist who lives up in Santa Barbara. She calls it the wheel of co-creation. And basically, this is the Big Bang here at one end, and at the other end is really the future. And each of these loops represents a process or a time period where you go from not having something to having something. So originally there was no universe, and then there's a universe. There was no Earth, and then there's an Earth. There was no life on Earth, and then there's life on Earth. There was no animal life, and then there was animal life. Again, all these are over eons of time. There was no human life, and then there's human life. And then this big circle here is where we are presently, where she describes the process of where, as self-aware beings, we are becoming aware of our own evolution and developing the capacity to direct it. And you say, well, where is that going, right? Well, the next loop over she calls universal humanity, which is a new species of human beings that will evolve out of our awareness. For the first time, in at least in the history of our planet and the history of life as we know it, the life itself is becoming directly involved in its own future and what it's going to look like. Now, that's a pretty powerful concept. And then it loops out, that's not the end, it just continues to go. Dan Millman, in one of his books, says, every positive change, every jump to a higher level of energy and awareness involves a rite of passage. Each time, to ascend to a higher rung on the ladder of personal evolution, we must go through a period of discomfort, of initiation. I have never found an exception. So when we bring this down to the individual life, what does it mean? It means that we are evolving. And the model I used in Baltimore is the spiral dynamics model that we've talked about, which is a model of understanding how human beings respond to an increasingly complex world. And what happens is, as we've evolved over time, this model, in looking at how that happened, has recognized that there are currently 9 levels of human, what they call levels of awareness, where human beings have evolved to live in more and more complex worlds. And right now, this is the first time in the history of the planet we've had that many levels existing at one time. Again, you go back 1 million years ago or 500,000 years ago, there was one level. And that level was very, very simple. Didn't have the capacity of really any significant self-awareness, didn't have the capacity to even form a tribe. And then the tribal consciousness somehow began to evolve and emerge, and a second level existed, along with the first. And then a third level emerged, and a fourth level, and a fifth, and sixth, and seventh, and eighth, and ninth. And guess what? The last 4 levels have emerged since the 1960s. Things are speeding up, folks. The conversation, if you're in an evolutionary conversation for more than a month, you're behind. because another conversation has started over here that picked up where you were and went off in another direction. Now, it doesn't mean we all have to be at the leading edge. That's not what I'm saying at all. But if we don't have some kind of an understanding of the nature of the process, then what happens is the world looks like it's falling apart when what it's doing is self-organizing. We mistake the signs because we must go through a period of discomfort and initiation as individuals anytime we move to a higher level of existence, and so does any group. Joseph Campbell talks about the idea of if you want the life that's waiting for you, you've got to give up the life you have. The way the snake sheds its skin. When the skin gets too tight, the snake releases it and moves on without a second look. We don't tend to do that, do we? When our current situations get too tight, we tend to cling to them and think about how wonderful they are. There's an old joke that says, how many Southerners does it take to change a light bulb? Well, the answer is 6. 1 to change the light bulb and 5 to talk about how fine the old one was. Anybody here ever stayed in a relationship too long? You know? Anybody ever stayed in a job that killed your soul too long? Yeah, see, that's what we do. We have this kind of we get emotionally attached to what is, and we don't want to let go of it, and we miss the fact that there's a whole new thing unfolding that would be something greater for us. But you can't go into the greater when you're hanging on to the old. I did a talk once, you can't steal second unless you take your foot off first base. You know, and second base always looks good, but I'm feeling safe here. I'm miserable, but I'm safe. Right? So that's what Dan's talking about. So what you see in terms of upheaval in cultures around the world is all these cultures at all these different levels are having growing pains. That's what's going on. That's what's going on in the political system of this country. We have outgrown our model. And the people in the model either don't know that or don't know what to do about it. So what happens when what you've been doing stops working? You do what you've been doing, only louder. You ever done that? I know this has never worked in the past, but maybe this time, if I yell at my kids enough, they'll love me. Doesn't work. So it seems to be that, here's another good question. If God made the universe out of itself, would it make a universe that was incompatible with the life introduced into that universe? Or wouldn't it make sense that life that evolves into an evolving universe would know how to evolve? And when we reach a point of being consciously aware of the evolutionary nature of the universe, and we still don't evolve, maybe we're the problem. Not that the world is changing. The world's going to change. It's always changed. It's going to get more complicated. It's always gotten more complicated. Even when it seemingly goes backward into a more simplistic place, like when you bomb the hell out of a country from time to time, what emerges is more complex than what was there before. Every single time. Every single time. One of the things that the new evolutionary thinkers are pointing out is that we tend to have a cultural view of things as being solid. Solid looks like a rock. We tend to think that certain things in our world and our universe don't change. We tend to think that maybe our parents, as we know them, shouldn't change or don't change. And then when your parents, one of your parents gets a new boyfriend or girlfriend, it's like, oh my God, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to be the way I know you are, which is solid. We get upset at inflation of our money. Our money should stay the same value as it was when we got it. It should be solid, but it isn't. It's fluid. Everything is moving. Everything is vibrating. Nothing in the whole universe, nothing in the whole universe ever stands still. That chair you're sitting in that looks so solid isn't. If you were the size of an electron, you'd fall right through it. But you're bigger than an electron, so you're sitting on a couple of trillion widths of electrons that holds your butt in place. But only temporarily. So everything isn't solid, it's fluid. You and your life experience is not solid, it's fluid. Everyone that you know is not solid, they're fluid. Every organization, every institution, every process. Nothing is solid, it's fluid. I mean, my God, of human institutions, could there be anything more solid than the church? Church is looking pretty fluid these days, isn't it? It's in motion. It's evolving to its next form. And you know, here's an interesting thing that many of the evolutionary thinkers say. It's not us that's directing anything. It's the information itself that is using the form to express itself in a more complex way. That you are driven by the ideas within you. And those ideas have a life of their own. And they're not just your ideas. They're part of the universal consciousness. Remember years ago when Orson Welles did those wine commercials and he said there is nothing like an idea whose time has come? Yeah. That was evolutionary theory in a wine commercial. Yeah, I didn't get it at the time, but, you know, I just liked the wine, but not the idea. This is Carter Phipps, who Carter Phipps, if some of you may know him, he was the editor of What is Enlightenment magazine that became Enlighten Next. He says, I believe that our emerging understanding of evolution in all its many shapes and sizes and dimensions is so fundamental that it would be hard to overstate its significance. So if I think I'm living in an unchanging world, if I think that people don't change, if I think that institutions can always be relied on to have the same values and express the same way, he points out in his book that one of the great realizations of humanity was when the first human being felt an earthquake. Because the earth is supposed to be solid. And the more we learn about the earth, the more we learn it isn't at all, right? It's like a bunch of dinner plates sitting on a ball of magma. And you're on one of these, actually we're right near the edge of two dinner plates. And as that magma moves underneath, because the whole earth inside is moving, from the heat being expressed and the nuclear fusion and all the other stuff going on, and everything's kind of sliding one way or another, and when a couple of those dinner plates move in a certain way, one jumps up on top of the other, and you have what we lovingly call an earthquake. And the reason it's so disconcerting, aside from the fact that it's dangerous, is that we believe the earth should be stable. A belief that the earth should be stable is based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the earth. It isn't. Never has been, never will be. If the earth were stable, there'd be no life on it. Because it can only be stable if there was no heat inside. And if there was no heat inside, it couldn't sustain life. So we are perfectly designed to live on an unstable planet. And guess what? We're unstable too. You know that about the person beside you, but I'm telling you about you. So Carter goes on to say, taken as a whole, this evolutionary theory, will constitute the organizing principle of a new worldview uniquely suited for the 21st century and beyond. See, this is the first time in the history of the planet where you can't be 20 years behind the times and still be current, or still even be relevant, because things are changing so fast. In the Middle Ages, if you were a blacksmith, your father was probably a blacksmith, and his father was probably a blacksmith. Not a whole lot was changing. There wasn't a whole lot of new blacksmith technology happening. So you could go generation after generation after generation and kind of stay in. Matter of fact, that was your name. Name is the nature of things. But today, it's rare that someone does what their parents do. It's rare that somebody does one thing for more than a few years. Because things are changing and changing and changing. We were in Manhattan for Thanksgiving weekend, where my daughter Heather lives, and Grace, my stepdaughter, Dorian's daughter, came down from Boston University on the bus, and we spent 4 days, running amok in New York. And Dorian had lived there in the 70s. Actually, the 80s, I'm sorry, into the 80s. Mid-70s into the 80s. And she'd lived there for about 10 years as a musician. She was a violinist and played everything from Carnegie Hall to being on Billy Joel albums, and played Saturday Night Live one night. So she was doing all that. And we're walking around neighborhoods where she lived, and she says, that's different, that's different. Hey, there was a restaurant, that's gone, And Manhattan looks pretty stable. It does. I mean, thank you. A lot of big former Manhattanites sitting here in the front. A lot of big buildings that kind of look like they've been there forever. But inside the buildings is continually renewing. My daughter Heather lives in Harlem. So Thanksgiving Day, after the parade, we went up to Harlem and went to her apartment, and we walked up to 125th Street along that area. Now, if you'd have been there in the 70s, right, the odds are it would have been a fairly dangerous place for a bunch of fluffy-looking white people to be walking down the street. Because that was just the nature of the place then. But now it's very different. It's still a almost entirely African-American neighborhood, but there's all kinds of other things going on and all kinds of renewal. We went into a soul food restaurant that had just hired an executive chef. They were paying him hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in Harlem. And we had a wonderful meal, And they had an amazing wine. They had a wine list that brought tears to my eyes. It was such a good wine. It was the best wine list I saw in New York. And you'd say, where are we? Because, we have the old idea of what it's supposed to be like, based on the movies you saw in the 1960s and 70s or whatever your impression was of that place and time. And it's not that way anymore. And if you go in thinking it's that way, you're not relevant. Give me a little help here. Thank you. Yeah, this is our backup because the other one wasn't working, so we're in a little bit of a remote control crisis here. You are evolving. What are you going to do about it? See, the question isn't, do you want to evolve? That's not an option. Because here's what happens. If I say, that's it, I'm putting the brakes on, I'm going to live my life the way I've always lived it, you may find that's very difficult to do. You may find that the world around you is going right past you. You may find you can't even do simple things like count on knowing how to use your new phone. How many phones did your parents have in their lifetime? Maybe, they went from crank to dial to push button. And every time it was traumatic. Now, if you have a smartphone, the phone is the last part of it you even use. Oh yeah, it makes calls too. It's my GPS, I have my lists on it, I'm playing games on it, I read the newspapers on it, whatever. And you go to the supermarket and they have self-service checkout lanes. And you see people standing there just cursing in front of them. I'll never belittle the checkout girl again. Boop. no boop, no boop, no boop, no. And then there is a strange item in the bagging area. That would be me. You know, it's just stuff like that. Even if you try to put the brakes on, the world keeps going. Innovation keeps happening. Pretty soon you're not going to get mail on Saturdays. What are you going to do on Saturday? For some people, that was the highlight of the day. Oh, the mailman's here. Hey. You know. And somebody will say, you still get mail? You still have a landline phone? You know? So my point is that, you know, we're living in a world that's accelerating, and we don't get to choose whether that's so or not. And you may be able to find a place where there's a Stone Age tribe that you can move in with, and that might buy you a couple decades. But, you know, the reality is that change is the norm. The reality is that most of the problems we have on a systemic level cannot be solved at the level of consciousness that created them. We don't know what it's going to start looking like when it gets out into that next loop on Barbara's model. We don't know. We can't even envision what the next 5 years will look like. If you'd have gone back 10 years, you never would have imagined Facebook, which now is like a utility. Wi-Fi. You know, I would go to a hotel and the Wi-Fi is not, what do you mean the Wi-Fi's not working? I'd rather not have the toilets work. I can work around that. I can't work around. You know, I've said that to hotel clerks. You know, I consider it a utility. And they just look at it, well, I guess it is, you know. We didn't even envision Facebook 10 years ago, and now there's 1 billion people on Facebook. If you're not on Facebook, you don't exist, which for some was appealing. Used to say if you're not on email, you don't exist. But now people under 25, under 30 don't use email. That's for old people. We had one of our teen groups had a change in their schedule for summer camp. They sent emails to all the kids. Nobody got them. You want to reach somebody that age, you got to text them, or you got to, whatever, you know, whatever the latest thing, at Foursquare or something. The slope keeps going up. Jelly Bean is a user system. It's not a social network. Got to know that stuff. What's Jelly Bean? Jelly Bean's the new Android operating system. See, if you don't know that, it's like back in the 50s not knowing how to flush a toilet. It's basic stuff to today's world. Like it or not. It's the indoor plumbing of modernity. Oh, it worked. Wait a minute. Back up. Okay. So everything is evolving. What are you going to do about it? We don't get to look at ourselves in isolation. So here's the value in having a teaching like this in your life. Whether you like the direction the world's going in or not, you have some tools that empower you to be more effective in it. You know, you start reading these books about evolutionaries and people like Ray Kurzweil and other people that are saying the first person that'll live to be 180 is alive today. And the first person that'll live to be 250 is 10 years younger than that person today. But we're not going to look like we look. We're going to be mostly metal when we do that. Not metal, composites. Metal's old-fashioned. The things that are happening. We went down to see my aunt and uncle in Cambridge, Maryland, out in the middle of nowhere. But they built a big Hyatt resort there where we stayed, and it's gorgeous. And while we were there was a meeting of DARPA. And DARPA is the branch of the Department of Defense that does all the way out crazy wacko stuff, looking at the future. And they're working on stuff like exoskeletons for soldiers that will enable them literally to leap tall buildings in a single bound. And they're also the same technology is being used to help people that can't walk. And you run the exoskeleton with your thoughts. There's no levers, there's no buttons. It's wired into your neurology. And then you don't need the wires. But I couldn't find any of them. They were in all these meeting rooms and you never saw anybody. I went up to one of the hotels. Where are the DARPA people? I don't know. We haven't seen them, but there's a whole room full of people that we don't know how they get from the room to the room. It's like they just appear. They're never in the hallways. Because I wanted to talk to somebody, What are you guys doing? Because they're doing the really leading edge, crazy stuff that's going to be coming into being in the next 10 to 20 years, which we can't even imagine. And they know that everything they're putting together now, they're going to have to change 15 times because all kinds of new stuff's going to show up in the meantime because we're in such a fertile place for newness. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. The world is not going to hell in a handbasket. It's going to heaven on a rocket ship. And if we understand that, we can align ourselves with that movement rather than resisting it out of fear and out of ignorance. We are being called to the next level for each of us and all of us. And it's not like you have to go out and transform your nature. You're already built for this. But what we have to do is learn to detach from what doesn't work or is ready to go, even if we love it. Even if we want to sit around and talk about how great that light bulb was, if it's burnt out, we need to change it. Or if there's a better light bulb, maybe we change it before it burns out. And we don't start a movement to give us freedom of light bulbs, which is going on in this country. I love my incandescents. They may destroy the planet, but that'll be the next generation's problem. There's a lot of tantrums going on in the world today. A lot of people stamping their feet because they want the world to slow down. It ain't going to happen. It's speeding up. We don't get a choice in that. We get a choice as to how we are with it. Ernest Holmes spoke about these concepts. Ernest Holmes was a leading edge thinker for his time. He wouldn't be a leading edge thinker now, except he'd be ahead of the average. Because what happens is, we'll get to this quote in a minute, but what happens is as speed changes up, the body of humanity spreads out, and you get some people at the very leading edge, the bulk begins to spread out, and you get some near the leading edge and so far back, and then you get a lot of people at the trailing edge, and the trailing edge gets farther and farther behind the leading edge. That's what happens. That's what we're seeing all over the world now. We're seeing people that are literally being left behind, partly because their governments don't know how to join into what's going on in the world, partly for political reasons, partly because there's economic reasons to keep people behind. But one of the things they talk about in this evolutionary book is what's it going to look like when these new levels start showing up, and one of the answers is we're not going to be economically driven in 50 years. That's not going to be the primary way we make choices. Imagine that. We weren't always. The economically driven culture is a small slice of the human pie. Ernest said, in this vast change we live in, the flux and flow and ebb and tide of evolution, there is a constancy, a consistence. There is in the midst of all movements something which does not move, and yet which moves all things. And what he's talking about there is the infinite mind in which all of this is unfolding. That's where we go when we need a little peace from the flow of change. We go within and we connect with that divine presence. And we rest and we focus And then we come back out fulfilled and ready to go. So we learn to adjust. We learn to nurture ourselves. We learn, just like we learn what to eat, we learn how to conduct ourselves psychologically and spiritually so that we're fully present for whatever life brings us. And life can't bring you anything that you don't have the capacity within to deal with, to transcend. But it is speeding up, folks. It really is. And that's a good thing. So what can you do if you see this and you say, maybe it's a little scary? Maybe you'd rather it wasn't this way? Okay. By the way, Spirit doesn't care what you think. The universe doesn't care what you think. It's just being itself. And this might not surprise you, would be to engage in this teaching as best you can and as fully as you can. Do a spiritual practice every day to get centered and remember who you are. Come here on Sunday. You're here, Go to class. Get into this community in a communal way so you have a support system of fellow pioneering souls who are traversing these circles with you. And don't be dragged into the drama of those who don't know what's going on, so they just want it to be the way it used to be. It doesn't work. It isn't going to work for them. It isn't going to work for you if you buy into them. Let them do what they're doing. They'll wake up or they won't. But if you're awake, even a little bit, you see where the truth is taking you. So I like to think of life as a roller coaster. It's not like the merry-go-round. The merry-go-round only goes one place at one speed. The roller coaster has its ups and downs and ins and outs, and it's fairly unpredictable, at least the first time you ride it. So this is like a roller coaster that doesn't come back to the station. And you got on it when you were born. And you might as well enjoy the ride. Thank you, and namaste.